Thank you for that introduction. Yes, my name is Emily Tella, and I am currently, well, not anymore. I actually finished my master's. I defended my thesis yesterday, so I'm officially a master's grad. And this is the work that I conducted within my master's entitled Identifying the Mental Health Status of Indigenous and Non-Indigenous Treaty 3 Police Services officers working in Northwestern Ontario. My supervisor was Dr. Catherine Sinden, as well as my committee members were Dr. Erin Pearson, Dr. Joy McDermott, and Miss Molly Acton. So thank you to them. Also, thank you to you, Dr. Dorman, for the immense work you did as my external reviewer, as well as to CROSH for funding this research project. Before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge my privilege in being able to work alongside Indigenous community members, as well as Indigenous primary knowledge users at Treaty 3. I'm currently at Lakehead University and would like to also provide a land acknowledgement. So Lakehead University respectfully acknowledges that our campuses are located on the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples. Lakehead Thunder Bay is located on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. Lakehead University acknowledges the history that nations hold in the areas around our campuses and are committed to a relationship with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people based on the principles of mutual trust, respect, and collaboration in the spirit of reconciliation. So understanding the traditional knowledge and cultural practices of Canada's Indigenous peoples. Traditional knowledge is made up of cultural practices for Indigenous peoples, including things like spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental components. Additionally, healing processes involve ceremonies, medicines, and offerings. Things such as diet, movement, sweat lodges, as well as offerings such as tobacco, sweetgrass, and cedar are all considered cultural practices of Indigenous peoples. Typically, Indigenous peoples use a holistic worldview for their traditional knowledge, meaning that they pass down their culture and tradition through oral teachings rather than writing them down, meaning their traditions are passed down through generations by elders. Although I didn't specifically look at traditional knowledge and cultural practices for Indigenous peoples, it's really important to note what they are and kind of what they do when you're trying to identify predictors of mental health among Indigenous peoples. Also, using traditional knowledge and cultural practices can help inform development of mental health strategies for Indigenous peoples. Intergenerational trauma, colonization, and residential schools. So Indigenous peoples have experienced colonial practices which have suppressed and removed their cultural identities while instead forcefully assimilating Indigenous children into Euro-Western colonization through residential schools. As a result of this, it has caused severe trauma experienced and passed down through generations of Indigenous peoples. This has caused intergenerational trauma among this population. Intergenerational trauma has been found to lead to anxiety, depression, and addictions among Indigenous people. Additionally, Western treatment approaches are often ineffective among Indigenous peoples as they do not take into account their traditional knowledge and healing practices. Prior to colonization, traditional justice was grounded in healing and reconciling. Until the 1960s, the Canadian federal government enforced laws on reservations. It should also be noted that this sort of law enforcement coming in through colonization has created a distrust between Indigenous peoples and the law. Therefore, in the 1970s, self-administered policing services were founded. In 1992, the First Nations policing program was brought to Canada. And then in 1999, the Treaty 3 policing initiative was created in Northwestern Ontario. which brought into fruition the Treaty 3 Police Services, which became a First Nations self-administered police service that works in rural Northwestern Ontario. Understanding Treaty 3 Police Services. So Treaty 3 is located in rural Northwestern Ontario, and their job is to serve rural Indigenous members. And because of this, they primarily employ Indigenous police officers. Treaty 3 is responsible for full policing duties in rural Northwestern Ontario that span approximately 55,000 square miles and police around 23 First Nation communities, which you can see right here on this map, all the places in which they police. In addition to this, there are contextually specific factors that impact Treaty 3 officers' mental health. For example, they are tasked with performing a variety of non-work related jobs that are outside of their description as a police officer. So because they're often working in these remote, isolated communities where there is a lack of other police officers due to shortages, they must support community programming as well as other facilities. Because of this lack of mental health resources, in addition to the intergenerational trauma that Indigenous peoples experience, police officers working in these communities experience repeated exposures to individuals who are in a mental health crisis. In addition to this, there are increased rates of crime, victimization, physical and sexual assault within these rural Indigenous communities. An Indigenous person is 7 times more likely to experience or to be murdered in Canada in comparison to a non-Indigenous person, and 2 times more likely to experience or be a victim of physical and sexual assault. There are also great challenges for Indigenous police officers as they are often the ones responsible for handling these calls, as Indigenous peoples typically favor to be responded by an Indigenous person or an Indigenous police officer, as well as the fact that they are also dealing with a history of intergenerational trauma themselves. Therefore, when they're called to action involving cases like this, it typically has a larger impact on them. There's another layer on top of this that not only Indigenous and non-Indigenous police officers who are working in rural Northwestern Ontario have to experience in regards to mental health. Police officers in general are at a higher risk of developing mental health disorders, as well as mental illness because of the occupation that they work in. For example, police officers experience critical incidents on a daily basis. A critical incident is a work-related trauma experience that police officers are more susceptible to. For example, experiencing a death of a civilian, experiencing a car crash, or experiencing things such as sexual or physical abuse when they're receiving calls to action involving that. This has been found to lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health disorder that police officers are likely to develop following experiencing a critical incident. So when they experience this critical incident, it could lead to further thoughts and images that revolve around the critical incident that last a long time after the incident is actually experienced. To be diagnosed with PTSD, a police officer has to experience an event in which their response is fear, helplessness, or horror. They must also have 3 distinct types of symptoms in regards to PTSD, being experiencing the event and avoiding reminders of the event, as well as experiencing hyperarousal for a minimum of 1 month. Another sort of concept that police officers are more susceptible to is stigma associated with seeking mental health support. Because policing is an occupation that is deeply rooted in independence, heroism, as well as considering themselves as strong and responsible for protecting others, when police officers experience mental ill health, they often fear as though community members as well as their management may believe they're unable to complete their job. So as a result of this, they may hide their mental ill health, and this causes self-stigma. So self-stigma happens when a police officer views themselves as their mental illness or the mental ill health they are feeling, rather than as an individual, and instead stigmatizes themselves, which is very problematic as this causes increased mental illness in police officers, and it may prevent them from properly working with community members for the job. So this brings me to my problem statement, which kind of revolves around my entire research that I did. When I started working with Treaty 3 and looking into this a bit more, I found that there was no existing research studies that aimed towards understanding the mental health of Treaty 3 officers. When I kind of approached Treaty 3 to do this research study, I was sort of asking them, so what steps do I have to do in regards to ethics or things like that to do this research? And they were just happy that I wanted to do the research with them, and they didn't have any protocols in place, which just really shows the lack of research that is being conducted in rural Northwestern Ontario for police officers. So as I kind of mentioned, Indigenous police officers experience unique challenges because of their background with historical and intergenerational trauma, which when they have this background and they're working with other Indigenous community members who have this, it can be really problematic. So having an improved understanding of police mental health indices could lead to the implementation of contextually relevant services and support, which is sort of what I'm hoping to do in the future. The purpose of my research was to identify potential mental health exposures. So I did this by looking at work-related critical incident exposures, meaning events that police officers experience on the job, as well as non-work related critical incident exposures, meaning things that they experience outside of work in their past that may have impacted their mental health. I also looked at adverse mental health outcomes, and I did this by looking at PTSD risk within police officers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous at Treaty 3. And lastly, I looked at barriers to accessing mental health support, and I did this through looking at self-stigma associated with seeking mental health support, and of course, among Indigenous and non-Indigenous Treaty 3 officers. I also took a knowledge translation strategy approach to this research. I did this for a number of reasons, but the primary reason being that it allowed me to take an Indigenous lens to the work. So I had 2 female Indigenous primary knowledge users from Treaty 3, who you can see in this picture right here, who really helped to facilitate this project from very beginning stages to the very end stage. This helped because it allowed my results and my findings to be contextually relevant to the population in which I did the research on. An integrated knowledge translation approach, for those of you who don't know, just means that you're incorporating knowledge users through all stages of the research rather than you coming up with all the work yourselves and presenting the results to them. So this allows your work to incorporate what is important to them. So when I was trying to determine my methodology, I worked with them and sort of had an open conversation about, okay, what are the problems that you guys are experiencing, and then how do we want to tackle this? So this really allowed the work that I did to be meaningful for them. And I actually think that that was probably one of the hardest parts of doing this research project and the most helpful thing I learned throughout my master's. And I'm also hoping to use the research I found and bring it back to these knowledge users and Treaty 3 officers through information sessions, as well as lay summaries and infographics that I'll report right back to them. Right here in this little image is the knowledge to action framework that was created by Graham et al. And it just shows what stage your research is in. So my research is currently in the identify the problem and determine the know/do gap. The findings that I found for my research project were that Treaty 3 officers experience high work-related and high non-work-related mental health exposures. In comparison to the literature, My research was fairly similar in that for high work-related exposure, police officers had around the same amount, although we found that what the highest critical incident that our sample of officers experienced was different from what the literature found. So our highest critical incident that happened at work within both Indigenous and non-Indigenous police officers was responding to a call to action involving a sexually assaulted adult, which for other research studies was not the case. So their highest critical incident that they found within their sample of officers was often experiencing a badly beaten body or experiencing the body of someone recently dead. We need to do more research to understand why we found this discrepancy in what was impacting our officers and what was impacting their officers. A main reason for this would most likely be because our police jurisdiction is so small. So there's currently 74 police officers working at Treaty 3, whereas in these more urban studies that they conduct, they have around 700 police officers who are working in large communities such as New York, California, etc. A reason that we think that receiving a call to action involving a sexually assaulted adult was so high is because of this history of intergenerational trauma among rural First Nations communities. Intergenerational trauma has been identified as a predicting factor to sexual or physical assault. We identified this as a really critical problem that needs to be looked at further in the future. In terms of non-work related mental health exposures, we found that our police officers experienced approximately 3 non-work related exposures, which is similar to the literature whose officers also experienced around 3 non-work related exposures. Our highest non-work related mental health exposure was experiencing something that was not asked within the brief trauma questionnaire. So we need to do more research to understand what this may be, but we also think that this might have been impacted by intergenerational trauma, which was not asked about within non-work related mental health exposures. Overall, though, we did find that our non-Indigenous police officers had higher critical incident exposure in comparison to our Indigenous police officers, which needs to be looked at further as to why there was this discrepancy. Furthermore, Indigenous police officers had higher non-work related trauma exposure and PTSD risk in comparison to our non-Indigenous sample. When looking at self-stigma associated with seeking mental health support, we did find that Treaty 3 officers would not experience stigma when seeking mental health support, which we were not expecting to find, but it also needs to be looked into further. But it is a good finding, meaning that they are likely to not experience stigma when they're seeking support. Although based on our results, we need to look further into if they are potentially not accessing these mental health supports for a certain reason, as there's high mental health within this population. For our study implications, the research we conducted was a baseline finding that can lead to the development of mental health resources for Treaty 3 officers. It can also be used to inform future research aimed to mitigating potential adverse mental health outcomes among Treaty 3 officers. Additionally, we identified that there is a need for future research to inform the development of mental health prevention and management addressed through Indigenous traditional healing methods. So how can we improve things? There obviously is a lot more work to be done. So since this was a baseline research study, meaning it was the first study to ever be done, looking at these factors with a specific group, we wanted to avoid participant burden. Therefore, we only looked at a few specific factors that can impact mental health, which in the future, we're hoping to look beyond what we kind of explored. But there are a few things that can be done in the meantime. So it's really important to take an innovative approach to policing. So the first thing that's important is using a holistic approach, meaning taking into account sort of what community you're working in. So in this case, police officers are working with rural Indigenous community members, meaning their approach should take into consideration those factors. So incorporating sort of traditional and cultural knowledge practices could be very beneficial. In addition to this, using evidence-based policing, meaning that research should sort of have a seat at the table, so to speak, and knowledge users and management at Treaty 3 should take into consideration sort of what findings have identified and use that when they're incorporating their training as well as other resources that they're providing to police officers. In addition to this, ongoing training on Indigenous healing methods is very important. So teaching police officers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, sort of what are the best practices to be using when working with these community members, as well as using a wellness lens for staffing and scheduling. Because Treaty 3 employs primarily Indigenous people, it is important to take that into consideration also for staffing and scheduling. So a few things that can be done for this include that when there has been a very busy day or a lot of critical incidents have happened on the job, it's important to give police officers the time they need to heal from this. So if that means having a longer debriefing session at the end of the shift, both formal and informal, to give officers a kind of chance to talk about it, as well as if an extreme critical incident is experienced, there should be introduced a wellness day for police officers, giving them the time to heal how they best heal. So for Indigenous peoples, this may mean going out into the land and having a day to sort of deal with this trauma, versus this might be different for a non-Indigenous person. In conclusion, from my findings, I have identified that Treaty 3 officers experience high rates of mental health exposures and adverse mental health outcomes. Furthermore, Treaty 3 officers did not experience self-stigma if or when seeking mental health support. Indigenous officers are at a high risk of developing PTSD, which must be looked into further. There are also unique police challenges that exist in rural Indigenous Northwestern Ontario communities, from, as I mentioned, intergenerational trauma, lack of mental health resources and support. And findings can be used to inform and support the need to develop a contextually relevant and psychologically healthy workplace. Thank you.
Wonderful job, and congratulations.
Sure
yeah, your slide disappeared, but that's okay. I don't know if we need your slide to answer the questions. It's interesting across the three talks, you know, really the recurring themes are, you know, empathy and recovery. At least that's what I'm hearing a lot of. And I thought it was actually very positive that that you didn't find that stigma piece to accessing services. So maybe the message around mental health is getting out there. So a couple of questions for you. First, is there a lack of mental health providers and recognition in Indigenous communities in general, or just with the Treaty 3 police service officers?
Sorry, you just kind of cut out there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is there a lack of mental health providers and recognition in Indigenous communities in general, or just with the T3PS officers?
So for my study, I just looked at Treaty 3 officers, but they are responsible for policing in all of Northwestern Ontario. So they look at all the Indigenous communities among Northwestern Ontario. I would think that in other areas, I'm not sure outside of Ontario, but for sure in all of Ontario and specifically rural Indigenous communities, there is a lack of mental health support just in general. So typically when services are needed, they're often provided on a fly-in basis, meaning that they don't have support readily accessible as you would in urban communities. So they either need to set up a treatment plan going forward and be sent into these urban communities if it's a mental health crisis, Or if that's not the case, then they're often flown in and provided them. So they're not at easy access. One positive that came from COVID is that there is increased sort of telehealth and telemedicine that's sort of being integrated into these Indigenous communities. So that's been a positive, because just even like counseling supports and services such as that are being more used, and they're sort of being more brought into these communities.
Right. Okay. How big of an issue do you think funding to the Treaty 3 police service officers is? I think with respect to what you're looking at. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say it's a pretty big issue. When I was sort of looking into the literature around the funding they receive, typically smaller jurisdictions and self-administered jurisdictions receive less funding than, say, provincial would get access to. So it definitely adds to the lack of workers that they have at these jurisdictions. So I would say it probably does add quite a bit.
Okay, and other than the potential limited access for Indigenous officers, would you find that the difference in the stigma of finding mental health support may be related to the different cultural methods of storytelling and sharing experiences?
Yeah, I would say that it would, for sure.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that myself. Is there any discussion about that at all? And like within the officers or the people you talk to, they mention anything about that?
No, but I know that for stigma, there is the racial piece to stigma. So when I actually was very lucky because I got a chance to do an in-person session with all of the police officers that do work at Treaty 3. So I had a chance to just have an open discussion with them. And they sort of had mentioned that there is a piece revolving around the fact that Indigenous peoples feel as though they're more stigmatized, because there is this misconception that Indigenous peoples aren't as likely to be able to do their job as a non-Indigenous person would be able to do. So they have this additional stigma piece due to their race, which I'm sure has also an impact on that.
Right. Okay, sorry. I was going to ask a question, but there's another question, so I better prioritize the Q&A. Could you please briefly explain what the Treaty 3 stands for and what it means?
As in the name?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, the land that they work on is identified as Treaty 3, so that's where they got their name. But they take a different approach to policing than, say, the Ontario Provincial Police would. So they actually do incorporate their traditional teachings into their police work. So they follow things such as the medicine wheel, as well as the 7 grandfather teachings. They take all that into consideration for their policing duties.
Okay. So real quick, you said as part of the knowledge translation, you've presented all of this information back to the police services. Were they surprised? Were there what were their thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that they were surprised, just because I'm sure they have an understanding because of what they must deal with on a regular basis. But now that we've sort of identified this, they're for sure interested in going forward and looking into more about what they can do with these results. So now that we've kind of had these findings, okay, so that's great, but what do we do now, sort of thing. So
right.
I'm definitely hoping to continue on this work. I would really like to do a qualitative piece, so doing sort of interviews and getting even more of an Indigenous lens. It's hard with the current literature and questionnaires that exist, because even when asking about PTSD or when asking about brief trauma, they don't ask, oh, has intergenerational trauma or has your historical background sort of impacted why you might experience these things? So for sure, looking at that, I think would be important for them, but they're definitely, a great thing about this research is that everyone was very eager to continue to do the work, as well as the police officers themselves. They were interested in what we were doing. So they wanted to know what we were doing, like they were involved, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it helps people to have somebody else kind of reaffirm what they know, and that helps them move forward.